So the title of the talk that I'm giving today is Transformative and Disruptive Developments in Acculturation Psychology. It will consist of two parts. First part where I present some research on majority group acculturation, which I believe might have the potential to transform some of the future research in the acculturation field. And afterwards, I'm going to present recent results from a meta-analysis that we ran on the association between acculturation and adaptation that kind of questions some of the core beliefs that we have held in the field of acculturation psychology for many years. As we all know, migration rates are at an all-time high worldwide, and this increasing immigration has led to more diversity and rather drastic changes in the ethnic compositions of many societies worldwide. For instance, if we look at the United States, we can see that the ethnic white Caucasian group that for longer historical periods formed a numerical majority group now has become an ethnic minority or a majority minority in more than 100 counties. Similarly, we can look at the city level. There are several examples of cities where the former ethnic majority group now has become one of several minority groups. In these times of shifting demographics, we believe that it is important to finally start understanding how immigrants and minority group members change majority group members culturally. As we all know, acculturation has been defined as a process of mutual accommodation. However, if we take a look at research so far, we can see that most research on majority groups has actually not focused on the cultural changes that they experience. Rather, it has focused on phenomena such as prejudice, threat, or the acculturation expectations that majority group members hold towards immigrants and minority group members. Now you may ask, what actually is majority group acculturation? And I will give you a working definition. So we define majority group acculturation as the cultural and psychological changes current and former majority group members experience and the cultural styles they adopt as a result of prolonged contact with immigrants and other ethnic minority group members living in the same society. And importantly, we do not consider majority group acculturation to just be cultural sensitivity. Rather, we define it as people adopting parts of minority group cultures into their default cultural repertoire. I believe that one good way to demonstrate what we actually mean with a certain construct is to show how we measure it. In my own research, we developed scales to measure specifically majority group acculturation, and these measure this acculturation through items such as how important is it for you to participate in the ethnic minority group members' cultural way of living? How important is it for you to participate in the traditions of ethnic minority group members? How important is it for you to live in accordance with the values of ethnic minority group members in your life? So, kind of the typical way in which we assess acculturation among minority groups, just this time from the perspective of majority groups. And one question that we asked ourselves from the very beginning was whether existing models of acculturation, such as the one by John Berry that we all use very frequently, could be used to understand the acculturation of majority groups in a systematic manner. And indeed, identifying different clusters, we see that across different studies, we do find some of the acculturation orientations that we commonly observed among minority group members. You can see that the integration and separation strategies commonly emerge in bottom-up analysis. That means that a sizable proportion of majority group members maintain parts of their heritage culture, but also adopt parts of the culture that immigrants and minority group members have. At the same time, we also see that a sizable group of participants reject the culture of minority group members entirely. They just maintain their own heritage culture. We can see that assimilation and marginalization are rarely observed, and importantly, as indicated with a light blue color, you can see that we repeatedly observe a diffuse cluster. And these are individuals that don't show any clear preference for either the majority group culture or the culture of immigrants and ethnic minority group members. Another question that is important to answer is, who are these individuals who adopt culture from minority groups and immigrants? And here we have some preliminary insights. The first thing you can see is that people who are less prejudiced, who have more intergroup contact, who have a global identification, and are more interculture sensitive and generally open to diversity, seem to adopt minority group culture more. At the same time, you can see that people who are ethnocentric, who have strong national identities, who perceive immigrants as a threat, they are the ones who show very low adoption of minority group culture. Now, these findings and insights can give you an idea of why we believe it's important to study majority group acculturation. And that is because it likely is an important factor influencing how people relate to other cultures in society, especially in situations where ethnic diversity is increasing. Generally, research is still at a very early stage on the topic of majority group acculturation, and many open questions remain. So, for instance, we need more research generally from different cultural contexts. We need to understand more what the predictors are of majority group acculturation. In particular, we need longitudinal and experimental research that can establish whether and when majority group acculturation has effects on sociocultural adaptation and psychological adaptation. Very importantly, we need to establish the boundaries between majority group acculturation and cultural appropriation. As John Berry already early noted, there's a clear power dimension to acculturation processes. And in this case, it is very important for us to understand the intentions for why majority group members adopt minority group cultures. Does it involve deeper cultural changes? So, for instance, people adopting and cherishing values and perspectives that minority group members bring to society? Or does it just involve the adoption at a very superficial level, let's say clothing, food? And at the same time, it's of course very important to understand how acculturation by majority group members is perceived by minority group members, right? What is kind of deemed acceptable for minority group members? And last but not least, we really need to understand the diffuse cluster. So we know that it exists, that it emerges across studies repeatedly, but we still know very little about who these individuals are. And I won't have too much time to talk about this, but for those interested in this study of majority group acculturation, we have developed a model in a recent article that is currently under review that might guide this type of research. Thank you very much for listening to the first part of my talk. I will now move on to the second part that deals with new evidence that we have obtained on the link between acculturation and adaptation. As we know, acculturation is commonly assumed to influence the adaptation of minority group members and immigrants generally. And especially the integration strategy, also referred to as biculturalism, is assumed to be most beneficial for minority group members. Indeed, if we look at the empirical evidence, it seems as if this assumption is strongly supported. For instance, a meta-analysis by Nguyen and Bennett Martinez, which is very much cited in the field, concluded that there is a significant, strong and positive association between biculturalism and adjustment. The effect size that these authors report and interpret is indeed substantial, of 0.51. However, there are some major limitations to this previous evidence. So first of all, taking the example of the meta-analysis by Nguyen and Bennett Martinez, effects are computed using a rather uncommon approach to random effects, where random effects are calculated as counter-null values of fixed effects, and this makes them very difficult to interpret. Secondly, this meta-analysis relies vastly on studies that are correlational. In fact, 95% of the studies reviewed by Nguyen and Bennett Martinez are based on correlational data. So against the background of these limitations, we conducted a reanalysis of the meta-analysis, and importantly, in addition, we conducted a new meta-analysis of solely longitudinal studies that hence can give us some information about the causality between adaptation and acculturation. I unfortunately won't have time to go too much into details in terms of how we reanalyze the data, but in short, we use the common Hedges and Alkin approach, and in addition, we control for within-study effect interdependency. So what did our reanalysis show? As indicated in red, integration was only very weakly related to adaptation, with a correlation coefficient of 0.09. The correlation between adaptation and mainstream culture orientation was 0.12, and the correlation between heritage culture orientation and adaptation was 0.11. Put differently, only between 0.8 and 1.4% of adaptation was explained by acculturation. So this is a much smaller variance than initially assumed. Importantly, these effects are still based on correlations. Hence, they tell us nothing about whether acculturation is directionally related to adaptation. To address this shortcoming, we conducted a longitudinal meta-analysis. That is, we assembled a data set of 19 longitudinal studies by reviewing the literature and reaching out to scholars. What we then did is that we ran cross-legged panel models to estimate the effect of acculturation on adaptation over time. And we did this both for acculturation strategies, but also for the heritage and mainstream culture orientation dimensions separately. Results were sobering. Basically, all effects of acculturation on adaptation over time approached zero. For instance, if we take a look at the effects of integration, all of these effects were close to zero, and they were actually inconsistent, sometimes being positive, sometimes being negative. The same was the case for assimilation or marginalization, and maybe the only noteworthy effect in terms of acculturation strategies was that separation was negatively related to sociocultural adaptation. Also, when we looked at the heritage culture and mainstream culture orientations separately instead of calculating acculturation strategies, almost all effects approached zero. The only noteworthy effect size was that mainstream acculturation at T2 positively related to sociocultural adaptation at T3. Given time limitations, these are only the main results, so for details, please take a look at our article that currently is in press at Psychological Science. So, where does all this leave us? We believe that the current evidence for the integration hypothesis is far less robust than previously assumed. At a more general level, our meta-analysis raises the provocative question of whether focusing on individual acculturation styles actually is meaningful if we want to understand substantial variance in the adaptation of minority group members. At the same time, we would also like to highlight that we found high heterogeneity of effects. Hence, it is still possible that certain unobserved moderators may be at play, such that acculturation indeed in certain contexts and under specific circumstances may predict adaptation among minority groups. However, in order to research and identify these circumstances, we need longitudinal and experimental research. For far too long, acculturation research has relied on correlational designs, testing hypotheses that essentially imply causation. As we saw in our meta-analysis, longitudinal evidence that can approach causality is currently missing for the most basic assumptions of acculturation theory. To conclude, I would like to thank my collaborators for contributing to the studies that I presented, and I thank you all for listening.